Thursday, March 6th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, the social issues that vulnerable youth in this province face. We're talking homelessness, food insecurity, mental health, the justice system. My guests are experts and advocates who have insights from the front lines. Quick backstory to how we got here. The idea for this show came towards the end of last month, right? You had reporting from the CBC's Abby Crowe, headline, NL Youth Centre Grappling with Crumbling Infrastructure, Rodents and Mold, Documents Reveal. A few days later, also by Abby, headline, there are 200 youth on a housing wait list in St. John's. Choices for Youth is asking for help. So Arlette Lazarenko, John Pike, and I were talking about, well, what do we do around this? And we have today's show. As you're listening to this show, if you have thoughts for us, the text line is open, 709-327-8206. Emails, thesignal@cbc.ca. We're in a time here, we've got a health accord, right? You know that. An education accord. There's lots of talk around social determinants of health. So with my guest, who I'm about to introduce, we're going to zoom in on young folks, right? Talk realities, gaps, what's not working, possible fixes, because we're all about talking about working towards solutions here on The Signal. Here with me in the studio, Melissa Power, a program coordinator, Upstream Canada with Choices for Youth. Jen Crowe, executive director of Choices for Youth. Adrienne Peters, criminologist, also a professor of sociology at Memorial University. And Josh Smee, CEO of Food First N.L. Welcome back, and welcome. All right, let's jump into it. Jen, let's start with you. When I say youth, there can be different thoughts. What age range, and everyone else can jump into, what are we talking about when we say youth for this discussion today?
Yeah, and thanks so much, Adam, for having us today. So primarily when we talk about young people, traditionally we've been referring to youth 16 to 29. So it's a pretty broad age range. Now, I have to say that with a caveat, because as an organization over the last 2 years in particular, we've actually officially changed our age mandate, and there's a reason for that. So we've officially changed our age mandate to be 0 to 29 because really the best way to end youth homelessness is to prevent it from happening in the first place. And so we are starting younger and younger. We run programs that support young moms and their children. We run programs that Melissa will speak to later that are really embedded in the junior high and high school systems. So while we certainly understand, that youth demographic of 16 to 29 being particularly vulnerable, it's like, how do we work to ensure that they're not vulnerable in the first place? And the answer is we start by focusing on them as their children, and even younger than that too.
Yeah, 0 to 20. I mean, that makes sense, right? Rewind it. Anyone else with the age range thoughts here?
I think this is a really important question, actually. So I'm glad you asked about it, Adam. So I'm speaking from more of a justice perspective here. And I think we have major questions around what our ages should be. So in the legal system, youth are defined as 12 to 17. And so basically that means that if you are under the age of 12, you can't be legally held responsible for any actions or activities you've engaged in. And then once you turn 18, you're then charged with as an adult. This, however, does not match what we know developmentally is what we should be defining young people as, which does include 0, even preconception, I would argue, up until the age of 29, 30, developmentally. That's what we now know should be considered a young person. And then we also have our distinctions within the child welfare and youth protection system, which goes up until the age of 18. And so we often have these divides between the justice system and then the youth supports and welfare system in terms of whose responsibility and role it is because of these differing definitions of what it means to be a young person or a youth.
So with those, before I go to the others, with those divides, what are what's the collateral damage? What are the gaps that this causes?
Yeah, and like Jen pointed out, prevention is the key. But at this stage, this is when we're seeing a lot of individuals fall through the cracks, so to speak. There's a lot of gaps in services, and the transition planning is not always there. So we have these young people who are already highly vulnerable, who are potentially going to become all the more vulnerable during those transitional periods.
I use this word, right? Vulnerable. Or ballpark of vulnerable. That's going to mean, again, like the age bit, and then that word, it's going to mean something different to many people who are listening. And me, until I started sitting in this chair, I didn't know anything about it, right? help fill me in here when we're talking vulnerable youth or in that vicinity. What's the reality that folks are facing, Melissa, from your experience with what you're doing with Upstream?
I mean, I think it's very individualized in youth, adults, anybody that you're working with, and the degree of vulnerability for one person can mean something different for another. But from our perspective, it's anybody who needs help. If they cannot help themselves, then they're vulnerable at some point. So it could mean their supports at home are not meeting their needs. It could mean that their supports at school are not meeting their needs. It could be in their community, their connections. They don't have medical services. It's a gamut of different possibilities that could make somebody vulnerable in our community and make them need supports like we have at Choices for Youth.
Folks who need help, right?
Folks who need help,
it's folks who need help. So it's young people, it could be parents, it's people who need assistance in some area. And in certain cases, I'm assuming, maybe that help is not there, right? Anyone else on? Josh, jump in.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that when you're thinking about what vulnerability means, it's not just about what's going on in your life, it's about what your community and support network looks like. So
we're talking systems too,
systems, right? So a good example of that in our world in food insecurity is that take two average families at the same income. If the family is Black, they're much more likely to be food insecure, even if they have the same income. And that's because generations upon generations of racism has pulled resources out of Black communities, right? So you're food insecure, the first place you look is usually your surrounding community. You're not going to the food bank first. You're going to see like, hey, is there someone else who can give me some help? And Black folks, Indigenous folks, there are communities that have been systematically deprived of resources over a long time, right? So when I think about vulnerability, it's not just about kind of what's going on in that person's life. It's where are they situated? What does that support network around them look like? Has that network been kind of systematically deprived of resources over time so that it might have less support to offer them, because the vast majority of help any of us are getting are often from our informal supports, right? And when someone's showing up at Choices or showing up at a food bank, that's often because they've exhausted those informal supports, or they're not lucky enough to have that kind of extended informal network around them, right?
Yeah, if you're a kid in St. John's and maybe there's a breakfast and lunch program, there's a bit of a social community circle around you, there's more grocery stores to choose from. But if you're a kid in Nain, where there's only 2 grocery stores, right, and a massive food, there's food security issues, food insecurity issues, like things can be very different depending on the community and the surroundings.
Exactly, yeah.
All right. And Adrienne, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think both Melissa and Josh pretty summed that up really well, and I think it's important to look at the individual and then within the context of their larger circumstances. And I think also recognizing that we all need assistance and support and help from whether it's every day to various periods in our life. And again, it's like what Josh said, do we have the wraparound already existing in our life that we need in those informal supports? And sometimes we don't. I would say a lot of us go through life where we have periods where we don't, but a lot of us do. And so it's the kids and families that really are lacking. And a lot of times they don't maybe identify as vulnerable themselves or even recognize these needs either. And so it's a really fine balance of how do we capture the folks that we really need to be capturing and wrapping ourselves around without also imposing our own judgments and stigmas and norms on them. But yeah, I think that's a really great point made by everyone.
Jen, that story, when Choices was asking for help, wait list 200 long. How do we get to that point? Like what? And that, I mean, me and you could talk for the whole show on this, but how do we get to this point where there's a wait list for youth in St. John's that's 200 long?
Well, there's so many different compounding factors,
yeah.
And I think so. I'll start with the systems problem, then we'll talk about like kind of the individualized problems in our community. So, the number one thing is that we've just seen such a rapid increase in average cost of rent over the last several years. So we look between 2020 and 2024, we saw a 20% increase in your average rate of rent in this city. In the same time period, we saw a move from 7.5% vacancy in our city to 1.5% vacancy in a 4-year period. That is massive. So really what you're seeing is like this conversation about vulnerability, I think, is so interesting because the definition of who is vulnerable has really changed in the last 5 years. And of course, you throw a global pandemic in the midst of that, and that really makes things even worse. So, when we think about housing insecurity and homelessness, we first need to talk about like our approach is housing first.
Yep.
You need to have a house first. So how do we make sure that we're continuing to have more housing starts and more housing completions, affordable housing completions in the city, in this province as well, because we're not the only part of this province that has a housing and homelessness issue, so that we are keeping up with the demand that we're seeing, not just from young people, but folks in general. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when we look at who is experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity, to Josh's point, there's an intersectional lens that we have to bring to this work always. So when we look at the homeless population of young people, 67% of homeless youth identify having a mental health challenge, and 56% of homeless youth identify as having a substance use challenge. So these things are so interconnected, and Adrienne brought this up already, but when we think about, okay, if you have a house first, we got to solve that from a systems perspective. There's no other way, right? And it's an all hands on deck. We build affordable housing, but we're never going to build at the same rate as Newfoundland and Labrador housing, and we're never going to be able to build at the same rate as the private sector. So it has to be an all hands on deck, and there's a role for everybody there. In addition to that, what ensures that we are able to maintain housing include things like having a reliable income. And we know that the cost of living has gone up a lot in the last several years. So again, folks who may have been able to live off of the income they were making 5 years ago may not be able to live on it today. And then the third thing is that what compounds that is mental health challenges, substance use challenges, physical health issues, family breakdown, and the list goes on. So we really need to tackle all three of those things: housing stock, financial security, and also mental health and other wraparound services in order to really address this mounting issue of housing insecurity and homelessness. And there is a role for everyone to play in addressing this problem. So just to quickly on the 200 folks on our wait list, Choices for Youth, we're able to house about 50% of the youth who come to us in a state of housing insecurity every year, and we're really happy about that. But we're not able to house the other 50%, which is the issue. So, and certainly ensuring that there's more affordable housing stock in our community is a big part of that problem. But then the other piece, as soon as we get that person housed, is making sure that they can maintain that housing and don't become entrenched in the shelter system or homeless again. So that's really where those wraparound supports come into play. So it's a number of different factors that certainly kind of contribute to this issue. And, there's lots of ways that we can look to solve it, which is the silver lining.
Yeah, and it coming into that support system, right? It's the baby steps to the walking, to the running of having the help, the supports to hopefully, again, thrive. But in the first bit, just move and graduate up, right? Like
Exactly.
that's what it's there for. Exactly. Can I ask, though, for the folks who don't get housed, what happens with them? Is it sleep? Like, is this like our sleeping, couch surfing, sleeping rough? And by that, I mean sleeping outdoors, maybe or maybe not in a tent, to be specific. Like, is this what it is for the youth who cannot be housed?
So in terms of youth homelessness, this sometimes does look different than adult homelessness in the sense that we see a lot of young people who are couch surfing. So they may have a roof to sleep under tonight, but they may not know where that roof is. Yeah. They may not actually know where that's going to be. So they might be couch surfing. They may be in and out of the shelter system. So again, it may be that they're calling the shelter line and they're trying to get a spot for tonight. It could be that they're sleeping rough, sleeping outdoors, sleeping in encampments, sleeping in like a warm place where they can lay their head, but that could be precarious. That could be precarious for sure. And it could also be that they're just like generally living in unsafe situations. So
the risk for exploitation must be massive.
Absolutely. And when we have these conversations with our colleagues across the province, sometimes homelessness looks like, well, this young person is living in an uninsulated shed. Right? Yeah. That's not having a home. that's having somewhere that you're sleeping, but ultimately that is not considered a safe, affordable, or appropriate place to live.
Yeah, it's surviving. Professor Peters, the story on Whitburn, right? The youth facility. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It raises a lot of questions about housing, and what we also expect are the needs of young people in their home living environments. And I think we need to remember that even if we're willing to put young people in a custodial facility or incarcerate them, that's still where they're living and spending time, and that's impacting their everyday health and well-being. And so whether they're in a shelter or in an open space in the community, or whether they're locked in an institution, we need to be looking at what they're being exposed to every day, which we've heard most recently, not unlike our other facilities in our province in terms of justice. They're not holding up so well, and the public seems to have forgotten, I think, about them.
Yeah, so we're talking mice infestation, mold, leaky windows, not like. And what's the age range for Whitburn?
12 to 17.
So these are 12 to 17-year-olds?
Yes.
Okay. What chance do they have going through that facility to, when we talk about a time when we need wraparound supports and everything else, what chance do those young people have to break a system of trauma, abuse, and what they've gotten into?
Yeah, the odds and the outcomes are not great, unfortunately. And the younger we criminalize individuals, the longer those consequences are going to impact them as well, leading as well into the adult system. And we also have to remember that when young people are criminalized, we are going to see those same faces in the adult system. So it's up to folks in our communities and individuals who are here with us today, and folks also listening, to want to invest in these types of services and programs and alternative mechanisms, so that we're not sending youth to those types of facilities. We're not removing them from their family homes, their group homes, their living environments, their schools, their programs, their peers. We need to stop trying to exclude them and try to bring them in and find safe spaces for them. So there's a major need for not just housing, but different therapeutic models of supports that are community-based.
What's our understanding like from doing work with youth in these facilities in the province compared to, say, work you may have done in British Columbia?
Yeah, so I have yet to do work here in our province. I say yet because I'm still optimistic somehow after 8 years.
So 8 years, and you've yet to do work. And that's not because you don't want to.
No. I've met with government and the courts as well. Many times, if anyone sees my name in the court dockets, I've been there as well, begging the courts. Because actually, under our criminal legislation for youth in Canada, under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, there's actually a section in there that's for research and allowing research and how research can and should be done within justice populations. And so I've attempted to do it here, but have unfortunately been met with a lot of barriers and obstacles. In BC, however, it's a vastly different landscape. So there's a much more progressive mentality, even in the communities, in terms of mental health and well-being and supporting folks who may be vulnerable or have various needs. It's certainly a mecca for social issues, I will say that, because a lot of individuals in our country actually even migrate to that area, to British Columbia and Vancouver more specifically, because of the type of supports that are there, and because it is a little bit safer, quote unquote, to be unhoused because of the community that exists there. So it is kind of an area in which there's a lot of supports and programming, but just like I said, the mentality and approach of leaders is also very different. And so there's a recent study that came out from BC that actually showed that youth who were incarcerated, the longer they were incarcerated, they were actually having reduced recidivism, which is the opposite of what we've seen in most studies. The vast majority of research shows that any incarceration is going to negatively, detrimentally impact young people. This study is only preliminary, and they have a lot to unpack there, and they're not condoning or saying that this is the approach. They're simply showing that long term, so these are kids who are severely involved in like gangs, serious violence, so quite heavy and serious types of offending. And if they spend longer in those facilities where there is a community, there are youth workers who aren't seen as COs or correctional officers, they're more seen as support workers. There's ongoing programs all day, every day. There's education, there's school. Again, I don't condone custody, but I did a lot of work and research in there working with these kids and researching them and talking to them, and it wasn't a bad place.
Yeah.
It was okay, and a lot of the kids were really struggling, but they were also finding connections and supports in places there. And then that was combined with supports when they got out that was pretty holistic and wraparound and developmentally and trauma informed. And we really don't see that in our province, I think, from what we're hearing from stories.
So if we don't see that in the province, and if folks like you aren't allowed to study it, what does that mean?
There's a lot of question marks.
Which informs or does not inform policy, right? I'll get some nods around the table. Josh, what do you think about that? Or if you want to dig into more of a food security, insecurity conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is generally, that's the starting point of good policy here, right? Is just understanding what the baseline we're coming from. We struggle with that across the board in Newfoundland and Labrador, sometimes for bureaucratic reasons, sometimes just because it's a small jurisdiction, and we just don't have good data. That's true across a range of things, right? You know, I would love to be able to tell you reliably whether food insecurity was worse in Western Newfoundland versus Central Newfoundland, but I can't. Yeah. Because we don't have this kind of like fine-grained data, and there hasn't always been a kind of a culture of pursuing it, right? Which is, you know, I think there's a conversation too about whether people are looking for that data when we can get it. So it is really challenging. It's challenging to build good public policy if we don't know what the problem is. But I think the other side of that, I think I'm glad you were bringing in sort of examples from BC. I know Choices does lots of work nationally. So do we. You know, it's pretty reasonable to suggest that the broader kind of national trends would play out similarly here, right? So like we know that young people are way more likely to be food insecure than the general population, right? And it's pretty clear why, because young people are way less likely to be employed. I mean, unemployment rates are much higher for under 30s than they are for the general population, right? And if you're not employed, if you're maybe relying on social assistance or income support, you know, it's really hard to be food insecure if you're getting by on income support. We all know that. And so I think, you know, that's a national trend. I think it's pretty fair to say that that's true here. And we do have provincial data that would echo that. We know that food insecurity is a huge problem for young people. But, you know, I would love if we had, you know, more fine-grained information on this. I would love to be able to go community by community and understand what these dynamics really looked like. And that's always a challenge in this work.
Right. Melissa, talk to me about Upstream Canada a bit and the work you do.
So it's interesting, actually, when Adrienne was talking about the Whitburn, and some of the young people that we've worked with have actually wanted to go to Whitburn for that community, for the youth worker that they have out there that they have a really good relationship with, for quiet sleep at night, because their home lives may be not like that.
Yeah.
So
and they've got a connection with someone there, and and that person might feel safe or helpful type of thing too.
Yeah, they have a connection. They have a bed to sleep in. They have food, and they have support. And perhaps in their home life they don't have that. So that's interesting to see. And I've talked to a lot of people, a lot of teachers actually, that have said, like, what can we do for these kids that are, you know, I mean, their behavior, they're trying to communicate in some way. And really, we need to support the family system. Like, there's no other way for, you know, a youth shouldn't want to be incarcerated to have those connections and to have food and to have a safe space. So in our program, the Upstream program, we're working preventatively. So we're trying to identify young people at an earlier age that may need these supports later in life, and equip their family circle and build up their village and identify who those people are that can support them, so that they don't need to come to Choices, or they don't need professional supports in the future. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the cool things that we are doing. Like Jen said, we're embedded in, well, we have 4 schools now that we're working in. And those schools have been amazing. You know, we all want youth to succeed. We all want youth to get their education and to be employed and to contribute to our society. But for a lot of these young people, they're in survival mode. So they're just trying to figure out their next step.
Yeah, fight or flight.
Fight or flight, so much. And if they don't know another way of life, then it's, you know, it's hard for them to discover it themselves. So if we can support the family who, you know, may have a history of crime or incarceration themselves, then we can kind of help show them that there's a different path that they can take.
What kind of support is that, right? Is it counselors, social workers? Like, what is it for supports that are needed for families like that?
It's a combination of all.
Bunch of stuff, yeah.
A lot of a lot of our young people want mental health support.
Yeah.
We're lucky to have a counselor on our team that can kind of short list some of the people that really are struggling and that are facing barriers to having mental health supports any other way. But I guess the youth and family workers that we have in the schools really get to know the youth, get to know their family on a personal basis. And we are located in the school, but we do things with youth in the community. So we're bringing them to food banks. We're bringing them to their doctor's appointment. We're trying to figure out, NLPDP and their prescriptions and, all this. There's a lot of education to what we're doing, but it doesn't feel like that because we're, they know that this person cares about them and they're going to help them outside of school, whatever they identify as their goals. So, if not committing crime is a goal, we're going to work with them to figure out how they're going to get their needs met in other ways.
Right. And I know the range can be vast with this, but I always like the description of it. What does success look like for this? And I know that can be like maybe a kid went to school today. That's success. Don't know about tomorrow. Yeah. I know it's a big thing, but for you, when you look at success and the work that's being done, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, very, very vast. It can be a kid went to school 2 days this week as opposed to 1 day last week. It could mean there's a youth that we've been working with who has been out of school for a number of years. So success for that person is not necessarily going to school, but it might be having a conversation about what their future looks like.
You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Stephen Gates is a professor in the Faculty of Education at York University. He's the president of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, the largest national research institute devoted to homelessness in Canada. Steve's on the line. Hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. So we're having this localized Newfoundland and Labrador discussion here today about youth issues. Homelessness is a part of the discussion. What's the national look like across Canada, whether it's compared to Newfoundland and Labrador or just like a broad perspective?
Well, youth homelessness is a really important issue in Canada. When we think of homelessness, we often think of like an older person pushing a shopping cart or something. But we know from research, Government of Canada research and other research that for most people who experience homelessness in their lifetime, about half of them had their first experience before they were 25. And moreover, of those young people who are currently homeless, 40% had their first experience before they were 16. And most communities in Canada don't have any supports for homeless people under 16.
Yeah, so when you say most, what's the stat on how many communities have those supports for youth under 16 in Canada? What's the percentage?
None that I know of.
Okay. Right. That's an easy percentage.
The other thing is, youth experience homelessness at the same rate as other age population groups, right? But in Canada, it's often an afterthought, right? I just found out, this came from Government of Canada recently, too, that, only 17% of communities even have a youth shelter.
Right?
Let alone preventive interventions that are much more effective. So here's the thing. If we don't want to care about youth homelessness, we certainly want to make sure that the problem doesn't get out of hand like it has in Canada. And that the numbers keep going up, that kind of thing. Our belief is if we were to effectively deal with young people's experiences of homelessness, that not only would we produce better outcomes for young people and their families, but also for our communities. And in the long run, we would have a big impact on chronic homelessness, because so many people experience chronic homelessness at a very young age. It's just not right that we allow young people to twist in the wind like that.
There was an international conference last week, I believe. Can you just talk to me about some of the points that were brought up there?
Oh, yeah, it was an amazing event. It was the first conference on the prevention of youth homelessness that ever happened. And we had over 600 people in attendance. And, for years we've kind of seen our role as helping to convince people that there's a need for prevention. But you had this very energized crowd of people who believe in the prevention of youth homelessness and want to learn more. And the good news is we now know a lot about what to do. We've got preventive interventions that have, solid evidence for their effectiveness. We have communities innovating in the space, and I'd say St. John's is for sure one of those communities in Canada that is leading around prevention. And so the question going forward is, how do we mobilize all that energy and knowledge so that we can transform how we respond to homelessness to produce better outcomes for everybody?
There's a federal election at some point this year, but we're also in a trade war with the United States right now.
That's right.
Where's your head at when you think about momentum towards trying to change some of what you've just laid out?
Well, I think we have to really seize the moment here. Everything you said there is true, but we can't let either an election or a trade war interfere with our efforts to improve the lives of young people and their families. And so I think, we've seen the government of Canada has taken more interest in prevention, but we need to see, firm commitments from all orders of government. The provinces and territories spend the most on homelessness, but none of them really focus enough on the prevention of homelessness and youth homelessness in particular. So we know what to do, as I say. We've got good examples in Canada, including in St. John's, and we need to share that knowledge and get all governments to get behind this. Because I think people are realizing that our current approaches aren't sufficient, right? It's like if you have a broken pipe in the basement, you can get a bucket and start, pouring the water out the window and then go and buy a gas pump. But at some point, it makes more sense to fix the pipe than to just respond to the pouring water. And so we need to take that approach in addressing homelessness.
Melissa, Jen, any other thoughts for Professor Gates before we let him go? Just want to double check.
Speaking my language.
Right.
And I think working in prevention, my whole team, I feel like we're all so very passionate about it because we know that that's what works. We see it. It's just really hard sometimes to show those results because, it's future. So that's why the research side of the upstream program is so important. And the family and natural supports work that the team is doing. It's just, that's the answer.
All right.
We just need to fund it.
Yeah, it comes down to funding. Go ahead, Professor Gates.
Yeah, what Jen's mentioning, things like upstream and enhancing family natural supports, we have the evidence for its effectiveness. The number one reason for young people to become homeless is breakdown in family relationships, right? And for the longest time, we've ignored the family, seen it as a part of the young person's past or part of the problem. And now we realize that, like any young person, if you have children, they need meaningful adults in their lives who aren't just professional. They need family members, teachers, coaches, people that are going to help them transition to adulthood in a healthy way. And we know how to do that. And, most young people who are homeless and left because of that family conflict, and Jen, you'll know this, most of them still long for family. Their needs and desires are in many ways very conventional. They want a good life. They want to be safe. They want to, succeed, that kind of thing. And adults can play a role. So, and the upstream one is great because I mentioned, the under 16 group. Upstream is a school-based intervention. and allows us to get access to those young people who are struggling at home and may be couch surfing or sleeping outdoors, and get them the help they need. And at the center of that help is enhancing their relationships with family members and building those adult support teams.
Steve Gates, thank you so much for your time today and taking part in this show.
Thank you.
All right, be well. Professor Steve Gates, there, Faculty of Education at York University, President of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, the largest national research institute devoted to homelessness in Canada. You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today we're talking about young folks in this province, issues they face, everything from housing, homelessness, food insecurity, mental health, the justice system. If you have thoughts about the show so far, or questions or feedback for us, thesignal@cbc.ca. The text line is open, 709-327-8206. Full house with me again here today in the studio. We've got CEO, Food First N.L, Josh Smee, criminologist Adrienne Peters, who's a sociology professor at Memorial University, Jen Crowe, Executive Director of Choices for Youth, and Melissa Power, Program Coordinator, Upstream Canada, also with Choices for Youth. Any thoughts on what Steve was saying?
I mean, I think from my perspective, yeah, it's Steve is really a pioneer in the youth homelessness prevention space and has done led and convened an enormous amount of research over the last several years on this topic, which has allowed us, I think when he speaks about the fact that we were able to come together as 600 people in this space, that certainly wouldn't have been possible a decade ago. And it's because this has become something that has been proven to work. And I do think governments are paying attention to this, but of course more is needed. So I really do, certainly thanks Steve for all the incredible work that he's doing. And also I think this piece around knowing what works really resonates with me, because we are, especially over the last several years, if we think about kind of 2020 and the pandemic and how do we handle this and what were some of the interventions, I think the benefit of where we are now is we actually do have some of that data now. We have it. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is what happened when we implemented CERB, right? Yeah. And what we saw across Canada and in Newfoundland and Labrador was a drastic decrease in the amount of family and child poverty. And Josh, you can probably speak to this more in terms of how this fetches up with your world. But those types of interventions really do matter. When we think about those systems interventions, that really change the course of people's lives, right? And it's not rocket science. It's like when you give people what they need to survive, they not only survive, but they work towards a path of thriving. And I think when I think about the Upstream program and I think about the work that Steve's doing, it's really about that, around if we can think about how do we wrap our arms around the most vulnerable and their families and make sure that they get what they need as quickly as possible, that is sustainable and going to carve a future forward for them, then that's where you really see that long-term success. And I think what's happened is because we're in a state of crisis right now, that we think about, well, what's the crisis response, right? And the crisis response often feels like, well, we need to make sure that these folks have a place to stay tonight. Oh, absolutely, there's no doubt about it. And we need to make sure that they have a place to stay in a year and in 2 years and in 5 years and in 10 years, and that they can build a life that makes sense for them and their family. And that's not by just investing in emergency interventions. We'll never get there. So I certainly appreciate those comments, and they really resonate with the work that we're doing and the focus on prevention. But it is, seeing the results, you see the results a bit more slowly, right? Because it's really working towards the conditions of stability rather than solving a problem that's immediate and that will take effect today.
Josh?
I think when I think about this, and so both our organization and Jen's and many others are strong supporters of a basic income as an intervention here. And when I think about basic income or other kind of income interventions like that, I think about those as being upstream of upstream interventions, if you know what I mean. That even before you get to the types of things that Melissa, you and your team are doing in people's lives, or that folks that we work with in food programs are doing, how many of those people would be diverted from ever needing that support if they had grown up with the material conditions to just, put food on the table and, go out and get some mental health support when they needed it, and that's not to denigrate the work of upstream interventions, but I think where these kind of one-by-one interventions in people's lives need to sit, they'll never solve the problem without also having this kind of structural change that turns off those taps or that pipe that Steve was talking about, right? And again, this to Jen's point, this isn't rocket science, right? There are lots of difficult and complicated problems involved, and people are facing difficult and complicated things in their lives. But sometimes I find it frustrating when we haven't tried the thing that the evidence tells us definitely works.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's no need for more evidence that getting more money into the pockets of folks who are the lowest income solves for a number of these issues, right? So it does get frustrating sometimes when you get these calls saying, well, we can't give them more money, so what else should we do? And that's really, it needs to be a both and, because even with, a basic income, there would still be folks who need upstream intervention for lots of other reasons in their lives, right? That's true with mental health. It's true with food.
Intergenerational trauma. There's lots of stuff, right?
Tons of things. But right now, we're choosing where that floor is, and that floor is so low that it just it really, I think, challenges the capacity of interventions, even those upstream ones. And we're seeing this also in the food space, where there is an emphasis on moving from, say, the food bank model of to things that would intervene earlier in people's journeys. The other thing I think, just to raise, it seems a bit cold to talk about this, but there's a cost calculation here, right?
I was going to bring it up.
Interventions early, whether it's in food or in anything else, have a huge savings down the line. Like, we know that if you're a kid or a young adult who's food insecure, especially severely food insecure, there are health consequences of that. They're going to last the rest of your life. And if we're being really cold about this, the government is going to be paying that bill. And when you add up what that bill looks like within the healthcare system over decades of compromised health, that could have been solved with a few $1,000s of help with food and other basic necessities when you're 16, the equation just looks bonkers. That's a really difficult piece of knowledge to translate into action, because you do also have to kind of spend twice, right? Because right now we're treating the symptoms of a neglectful system from before, and we'll have to keep doing that even if tomorrow we started supporting people in a better way. It'll take time for those benefits to show up on the balance sheet, and so there is, I think, a lot of this does come down to kind of political will and to the ability of people making these decisions to look 10 years down the line, right? And that data that's being generated by things like what Steve is doing and work like Adrienne's helps build the case for that, but it's still hard.
Valerie Tarasuk, Professor Tarasuk, gosh, I think we're going back to 2020. Mm-hmm. Something that has always stood out for me in an interview I did with her. She said, in an interview I did on food insecurity, I think you were in that one too. She said, the thing we keep finding out about folks when we give them money is they buy stuff to eat.
Yeah, shocking.
And it was like, and that was it. That was the end of the interview, right? Anyways, that has stuck with me and still sticks with me. And when people say can't, I like to ask why. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about food insecurity and Josh mentioned savings, right? And you talk about the health system. There's also the justice side of this. So, Adrienne, just your thoughts around whether it's misconceptions for young folks or the road that can lead them into whether it's, we'll say, an introduction to the justice system and everything that brings. I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah. So just thoughts on the cost calculations. Sometimes those conversations can seem kind of curt and crude, but they are important because I think they're the ones that are the political will, like you said. And the challenge with justice outcomes as well, and all these measures we're talking about, whether it's housing or food security or mental health and well-being, politicians work in 4-year cycles. And so our health and well-being, our food security, our just everyday security and well-being is not necessarily working in those narrow confines of 4-year cycles. And so I think that's always the challenge, is trying to make a case for this is going to help A, B, C, but also it's going to help everyone. That was also mentioned, like this isn't just for individuals or specific families or groups. This is for every community and every individual living in our provinces. And prevention, unfortunately, there's so much evidence on what it does, but it unfortunately doesn't have the same kind of salacious headline that maybe some tough on crime or harsh punishment or reactive and reactionary type measures do have, especially in political climate that seems to favor populism over common sense even these days, let alone research and evidence and lived experience and folks and the community's experiences. And so, but all of this feeds into the justice system. So we know that the kids that are criminalized are individuals who have had struggles in their family home, potentially have parents or siblings or family members who too were criminalized and involved in the systems. They are facing everyday food insecurity. Theft is one of the most common offenses that young people engage in, and oftentimes we're learning that theft is actually just individuals stealing food, whether that's men or women and or young people. And so just the types of offenses that they're committing is often reflecting some of the needs that they have, right? Mental health and well-being is also a major thing. So neurodevelopmental conditions, a lot of my work has focused on mental health, neurodiversity, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder specifically. We have incredibly high rates of homelessness in our province. We have incredibly high rates of food insecurity. We have incredibly high rates, some of the highest rates in our country of children in care. Also, who's being impacted is also tends to be Indigenous families, racialized families, Two-Spirit, LGBTQ, SIA plus families and communities. So it's again, is there a political will and interest to be supporting these families and these groups, recognizing that it's a holistic approach needed to also then help everyone. But instead, we tend to exclude ourselves, and even we learn this very early from our families and our parents and caregivers in schools. Don't go there. Don't talk to those people. Yeah. Why? Why would we teach a child they shouldn't speak to another child or shouldn't go to a certain neighborhood or this area has this definition or this name attached to it and you shouldn't go there? We need to be bringing these people together more, I would say, whether that's in our communities, in these programs, and families as well, and not just taking these kids and putting them in the programming, but again, keeping them in their natural spaces and settings and environments, as opposed to saying, okay, well, you need this, so we're going to put you over there, and you need this, so you're going to go over there. And I also have concerns around not just kind of targeting or judging or stigmatizing certain groups.
Yeah, like the rebellious kid or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. But the loss of our safety nets. Yeah. There has to be space to be a rebellious youth.
Yeah.
That's part of development. My friends and I, we used to actually do the surveys that we would do on the young people who are incarcerated on our cells. And sometimes our scores or our responses came out very similar to the kids who are incarcerated. And until we start seeing some of those similarities as opposed to differences in our communities with other groups, with other cultures, with other classes, races, ages, genders, sexualities, all of these things, we're going to constantly be leaving people behind and then potentially criminalizing them.
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking of like those dividing points in life, right? There's so many people I know in my life that if they were if their family was a little different or if it was a different area or a different race or you name it, maybe instead of going the zig to I'm okay, it's the zag towards whatever else happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I only have like 5 minutes left. We're working through an education accord here, right? We're in a time of an uptick in violence in schools. We've got folks who are issues with engagement and their deciders are trying to work their way through how to engage kids, young people in schools, absenteeism. How are we all feeling? Given your seats, and this could be a whole other show, but just give me your thoughts on where we are with this education accord when we're talking about youth and hurdles and challenges in Newfoundland and Labrador.
You know, I think, and I have had the great privilege of being on one of the committees and forming the Education Accord. And one of the pieces that keeps coming up for me is I think that we all kind of collectively have the same goal in the sense that, and Melissa said it earlier, like we all want the best for young people, no question. If we think about the role of a school, it's around education. And so the question that I pose, and I'm pleased to see the ways in which it's showing up in the kind of culmination of preliminary Education Accord report is, you know, where is the role for community-based organizations to fill in the gaps? We are not educators, we don't want to be, but we do see a role for ourselves in the sense that we want to go where young people are. So if a young person has a moment in their lunchtime and they are really in need and they're navigating like mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, family breakdown, they have maybe mom or dad is on brink of homelessness and it's really impacting the entire family dynamic, being able to go across the hall and have a conversation with someone they trust from the upstream team around what's going on. well, then that team can intervene, right? They're able to say, okay, let's talk about this from a mental health perspective, but also how do we get housing stability for your family? How do we support your mom in getting back to work? What could that process look like? And this is where we can intervene, and it's as immediate as possible, right? So that the issue doesn't compound in 2 or 3 years down the road, complete family breakdown, that child is now a young person who is homeless and has completely disconnected from the education system. Like, those are the real runoff effects, but this is the beauty of prevention, is that we can really start that process early. But it requires, from my perspective, that young person has what they need when they need it, and that involves embedding services like what we provide, but also so many other incredible organizations across this province within the school system as much as possible. It really has to be a partnered approach, right? And we often find that when we work with young people, they don't care if it's, if they're talking to someone who's being paid by Newfoundland and Labrador Health Services or the provincial government or Choices for Youth or another nonprofit organization. They just care that they can get their needs met.
Just have that person.
That's how we need to think about this too.
By the way, Signal listeners, next week, Tuesday, the 11th, full show, co-chairs of the Education Accord here in studio, open phone lines. So if you got questions about the Education Accord, Tuesday, lunchtime, half an hour earlier in most of Labrador, is your day. Final thoughts, Josh?
I think what we haven't talked about yet is that a lot of the themes coming out of the Education Accord and thinking about youth, when we talk about the age range going up into the 20s, we're also talking about people who are in post-secondary education. And I think sometimes when we're having a conversation about outcomes for young people out in community, we forget about kids who are in college and university, but they're facing a really similar set of dynamics. And there's a similar, I think, case for intervening in those situations. Like in my world, we just finished some research within the MUN campus community on food insecurity, which is extremely prevalent.
Give us the elevator pitch on that.
About half of the people who replied to the survey were food insecure. That tracks with other research. You, Adrienne, you teach at MUN. You're seeing this day to day. And I think we have a tendency sometimes to be a bit dismissive about these issues once they move into the kind of post-secondary population.
University's supposed to be hard.
It's supposed to be hard. You're privileged to be there at all.
Yeah.
But I think that's just not the reality of life on campus, whether you're in college or university right now, especially for international students who have a whole other layer of cost and challenge put on them. A lot of the conversations that we've been having when we're having a conversation about youth, that goes right through to the dynamics that people are facing in university and in college. And I think that's something I wish that in the broader conversation in community was had a bit more space, that people weren't as dismissive of, because there really are similarly, there's need to intervene there, and there's real need in that community.
Adrienne Peters, 30 seconds for you. Final thought?
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight education is a need, education is a right, education is prevention, education is support, education is intervention, education is everything. We very much need a developmentally informed approach to education in our province that starts, again, preconception all the way through to adulthood, including post-secondary. And I cannot underscore the importance of social sciences and the arts in this. I'm a bit biased, but I would like to say that everything everyone's talking about around this table today and many days on this show is related to social health type issues and a lot of social factors that we learn about in the social sciences. So yeah, that's my final piece. Thank you.
Melissa, when you're working with young folks, when do you see hope come into things for a young person as you work with them?
The second they either come back, so they come back to see you again, or you can just kind of see a little switch and a little light in their eyes.
You only have 15 seconds for this answer, but what's that like for you?
That's why I do what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good place to end it on today.
Yeah.
Thank you. Melissa Power, Jen Crowe, Josh Smee, Adrienne Peters, thank you so much for today's conversation. Folks, thoughts for us? The Signal at cbc.ca. You can call the Signal line and leave a message, 709-576-5260. Coming up tomorrow, we have an International Women's Day show for you, and it is going to be great. Show AP, Arlette Lazarenko put it together. The show will be about loving and appreciating the everyday things women do that we might take for granted. Is there a woman in your life you want to celebrate and recognize for what they do every single day? Get in touch tomorrow. Bernice Hillier will be in for me. I'll be back on Monday. Cheers, folks.